Exeter Time Trail is a collaboration between RAM, which is Royal Albert Memorial Museum and Art Gallery. This is a museum of natural history, which has anything, as you can see when the slide comes up, from stuffed giraffes to flints to Turner paintings. With 1010 Media, which is a local website development company, and the University of Exeter. The vision for this project was to design a mobile web app prototype that allowed users to encounter the RAM collections as they walked through the streets of Exeter. The idea was also for users to be able to comment on these trails, and in a subsequent stage of development to actually be able to generate their own trails. Halfway through the project, I thought this was running rather too smoothly for my taste, and I decided to bring in a new partner that would challenge everything we were doing. And for some reason, I decided this partner should be Exeter City Football Supporters Trust. Exeter City Football is, as the name says, the local football company, which went bankrupt about 10 years ago, and the fans bought it, and they're now running it. So in terms of what I was interested in was their history, their content, and whether that would also work in the kind of context that I was setting up for Time Trail. I was rather hoping to have a slide by now, but I will carry on anyway, because I know you want your coffee. The prototype currently allows for the design of historical trails, so that's, say, Tudor, Victorian, Elizabethan, whatever, and content-based trails, so for example, sport and well-being. Thank you. Sport and well-being, and was based on a pre-existing Exeter Time Trail website at RAM, which is widely used by the BBC and Osborne, which is a children's book publisher. But as you can see from the slide on the left, it offered a good level of content, but then all you could do was print a PDF and then walk around Exeter with your printed pages. And RAM really wanted to facilitate a much more mobile experience, both within the museum, within Exeter, and more broadly within Devon. So we started with what seems to be obvious, a map, and from there created or adapted, geocoded all the content that we wanted to put on the map, and created brief fragments of interpretation that users would encounter as they walked through the streets of Exeter. First challenge, of course, unreliability of GPS. Second challenge, of course, how to ethically move people through urban spaces, taking into account issues of access and so on and so forth. And third issue, which became huge for me, is we all know what kind of interpretation you want to put in a museum or in a gallery. How does that translate outside? How does that translate when you leave the building? In terms of research, we were influenced primarily by three bodies of research. One is a framework on trajectories, which I developed with a computer scientist called Steve Benford from University of Nottingham. This is really trying to predict the course of anticipated and actual journeys that people do through mixed reality spaces. And the framework identifies what we call canonic trajectories, which are pre-designed, and participant trajectories, which are what people actually do once they're in the space. And in this case, we were very interested in using the trajectories framework to understand how people would move in terms of space, in terms of their journey through time, but also in particular, which kind of roles would they take on, because we didn't want them to just be passive receivers of information. We wanted them to respond to this information. So we wanted them to kind of shift from being viewers, if you like, to spectators of something, to being interactors, to being documenters, and to be doing things. The second body of research we used was one by anthropologist Tim Ingold. He talks very interestingly about the differences between mapping, map making, wayfaring. And that became a huge issue for us in this process, because again, we wanted to use a map, but maps, of course, don't capture the territory. We know they're pure representations. Structures of the maps don't spring from the structures of the world. And Ingold really interestingly explains this in relation to these two maps. He doesn't actually use these two particular maps, but the first one, the larger one, is a Royal Navy map. He says Royal Navy maps very clearly show how people would follow specific points from a departure point to a destination point. They, so to speak, cross the surface of the map. The second map on the right, this is actually one of the RAM objects, is an Inuit map. It's a much more sculptural object. You can see the territory is less clearly recognizable. For the Inuit people, their territory was conceived as a network of lines. I was very interested in this idea of subjectivity and network of lines vis-à-vis this top-down bird's-eye view, which doesn't capture anything subjective, but rather tries to present some kind of holistic view. So, to go back to Ingold, we wanted to use a map because that's the easiest way to move people around a city. We wanted to use mapping, which is knowledge generating through movement, as a strategy for people to acquire knowledge, but also generate knowledge. And thirdly, we wanted to use trails as a way of marking their subjective journey through the city. We started with using Google Maps and then decided that we would use satellite views because they're, in terms of presencing and making people feel present in a space, are much more effective. We started also by using actual trails, but then we found that people put themselves in danger all the time by actually physically trying to follow the red line, so we abandoned that idea and just created a kind of chronology of numbers so that people could follow that in a certain order, but also if they didn't want to, they didn't have to. Once a map is clicked on, so an Exeter map or Devon map, the map identifies where the user is and puts them as a green dot on the map if the GPS is good, and as an orange dot if it's not so good. And then as these locations are approached, they come up. It says you're approaching this location. You can click on the number, receive the information. As I said before, we were very keen for users to become active. So at the end of each of these pieces of information, we inserted some affordances. And for this, we took inspiration from a number of other projects, particularly Serendipta and Derive app, which both use situationist strategies, again, to move people around the city in a way that is akin to meandering. And we were inspired by Blast Series Rider Spoke project, which is a kind of urban game where people cycle across a city and are asked to record memories of their past lives in relation to particular places in the city. So again, we merge canonic information and interpretation about these particular objects with questions that prompted people into some different kinds of actions, whether it was basic looking at something or whether it was leaving a comment. We were also interested in two projects called Findery and History Pin, which variously, again, encourage users to attach individual information to kind of canonic history views, if you like. And simultaneously, through our research with schools, we were not wanting to abandon the kind of aura of the original artifact. We knew the importance of handling. You can see this in the faces of these children. After the digital experience, they all really, really desperately wanted to actually go to the museum and look at the original objects and, if possible, touch them. So the whole issue of if you show an object through a digital journey to a user, you then have to reward them. And, of course, one of the advantages of these kinds of apps is that you can show objects which are not ordinarily on display. So how do you then satisfy the user by actually showing them something which the museum may have in storage? We were also inspired by some work that we ourselves do with Tate. This is a project called Art Maps, which has put the entirety of the Tate collection, there's 70,000 works, on a map. They've been geotagged, of course, and because they've been geotagged mostly by one person, a lot of the information is inaccurate. So there's a crowdsourcing exercise as part of this, which asks you to put the work in the correct location, and of course correct here is exactly the issue, because what's the correct location of an abstract Mondrian artwork, for example, and so on and so forth. So we wanted people to think about place and what it means to locate and relate yourself to place as you were looking at an artwork outside of the museum. And this Tudor trail here in Exeter synthesizes that particular moment when you're walking around this lovely little church. On the other side of the church is actually the supermarket Sainsbury's, and so you're looking at this lovely Ming porcelain. No, is that not the Ming porcelain? You're looking at artifacts in the museum in the context where they were found, but the context has changed so substantially that there's a huge gap between what you see and what you're and what you see digitally and what you see in the physical space. Again, this is why we decided to abandon the trail. You can see on the image on the right, the GPS is just too inaccurate. The trail looks like some very strange artwork gone mad. We tried to use existing platforms. We arrange in every trail, and then in the end we decided to use our own, because we wanted, again, for it to be an orientation tool, a search tool, a publishing tool, but in particular we wanted other organizations to be able to adapt their own content to these trails. One of the things that we developed was a Find Me tool. The Find Me tool basically finds you as a user and gives you your latitude and longitude. It gives you the ability to put where you are and the object that you may attach to where you are on the map. When we started, as I said before, working with the Exeter City Football Club, immediately the reality of what it means to work with such an organization became clear, because they said to me, well, you can use our archive. Well, what is that archive? That archive is two cabinets full of things. They didn't know what they were, where they came from, what the significance was, whether in fact they were significant, or what to do with them. So the first thing we had to do was stop completely and put together a team with help from the library and the digitization office at the university, and they had to actually create the archive. They had to then decide what to keep and what to give back to original proprietors and what to sell and so on and so forth. They had to decide what was valuable and for what reasons, and they had to decide what to digitize. And from that, we could then build the trails. So that is quite characteristic of working outside of museums and the reality of such organizations. They have a 100-year-old history. And what was really exciting for me was the fact that through this history, you really touch the history of the 20th century, from First World War, Second World War, the Blitz in Exeter, the Titanic, whatnot, name it, they were there. So through narrating this history of this trust, we really wanted to narrate a much broader history. We created two trails, 1 2.5-hour trail through Exeter. We created it very much through mobile research and development. The developer only could make it work by developing on the go, so we had to carry him with us while we tested. Of course, we still had issues with GPS as ever. But in the end, we were able to test the trail first with the broad community, and then we were asked, well, since you have such a thing, could you use it with our Kickstart program? Kickstart program is run by the Football Trust for children who've been basically kicked out of school, or who are at danger of being kicked out of school, who've lost every desire to learn. And because of this, the trust takes them into the football stadium for 3 months and just teaches them football. And through football, they teach them to listen to rules, to stay in one room, and eventually numeracy, literacy, and so on and so forth. So they said, could we use this trail in that way? And we realized very quickly that we couldn't use the other trail, because that took them outside of, in a non-protected environment. And we created a shorter trail that just takes place inside the stadium. Tested it with a very heavy staff to student ratio. As you could see, 3 staff for 5 children. But again, the issue is to calm the children down and make them stay in one place for more than 5 minutes. But they did focus for the entirety of the 2-hour exercise. And normally in a kind of ethnographic situation, I wouldn't show a photo like this one where the user is acknowledging you. But in this case, since for these kids to be seen to be learning is the worst thing in the world, for them to actually acknowledge you as a teacher was, for me, a sign that the thing was working. Because we knew the importance of handling and seeing originals, we ended the exercise in the boardroom with the children actually being able to touch some of the artifacts that we had shown them in the trail. Not only to touch them, but also we taught them how to photograph them for archival reasons, and how to create these 100-word bite-sized information that we had used in the trail. So the exercise was for them to finally handle the objects, research their history, write up something brief explaining the value of these objects to themselves, and that then became part of a trail that future Kickstart children could use. So just to sum up briefly, again, we used maps to move people around in space, and we used mapping as a knowledge-generating strategy. We tried to record these individual trails, and in fact, if you overlay all the RAM trails with the Kickstart trails, with the football trails, you begin to kind of get a very palimpsestic view of Exeter, which is very different from that of a Google map. We found two things primarily. First, through the user-generated content, the museum and the football organization learned things about the artifacts that they didn't know. In particular, the football organization, since they knew hardly anything about what they had in those cabinets. People actually wrote to us and said, "Oh, I recognize that comes from my great-grandfather and it means this," and so on and so forth. But second, when users walked around the streets of Exeter and encountered these objects, of course, they then kept on walking those streets in subsequent days, and they said they felt very differently about their environment. And that shows us the kind of social change potential that such an app could have, where you change the way that people move across space and perceive of their space because you've reattached, so to speak, an artifact from that space, which had been taken away and put into a museum. And I'd just like to leave it now because I know you all want your coffee. Thank you.
Thank you.